From ABC News. A television event. 100 years in the making. The century.
It was Christmas Eve, 1914, and briefly the shooting stopped. The Allies and the Germans waited in their waterlogged trenches. Suddenly a voice, and then other voices.
Actually, it began, I think, by singing Christmas carols. The Germans sang from their trenches, then the British sang it back at the Germans. That's how it started, really.
Someone lit a candle. Someone else held up a white flag. Soon, enemy soldiers were crawling out of their trenches to meet in no man's land. They shook hands and asked about each other's families. They traded German schnapps for English jam and cigarettes. They took photographs. And the day after Christmas, they went back to killing one another.
The century. No man's land.
In the first week of August 1914, President Woodrow Wilson was traveling by train from Rome, Georgia to Washington, D.C. He had just buried his wife of 30 years, Ellen. He was grieving, and he was alone. As he sat hour by hour staring out over the land where he had spent his youth, the thought of death weighed heavily. This was the old South of the Civil War. His earliest memories were of war, of Confederate soldiers wounded and dying in his father's church. The president was also forced to think of another war. He had just learned that the great nations of Europe had decided to go to war with each other. As he passed through fields where American soldiers had fought and fallen, the president wrestled with what role Americans might play now in a world at war.
When my grandfather became president, they hadn't really thought about world affairs and what part this great continental America could play.
Francis Sayre is President Wilson's grandson.
What was our mission in the world? What should we be doing with this new continent that the rest of the world sees as a vision and an ideal?
On that summer afternoon, the president considered his own journey. First as a college professor, then as a statesman, Woodrow Wilson had always believed that America's mission was to benefit humanity by example, as a peaceful democracy looking towards a world beyond war.
He knew war, so his first and foremost hope was that the United States would not be involved.
In 1914, the center of the world was Europe, and Europe was dominated by a small tribe of monarchs, bound by blood, entangled in a system of secret alliances, and determined to put as many men under arms as they could. No leader cared more about having an army than Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm. He was assembling the largest standing army of them all, 5 million men.
Kaiser Wilhelm was physically, emotionally, and intellectually unbalanced. He was a grandson of Britain's Queen Victoria because all those ruling families were intermarried. He never got over the fact that his grandmother, Victoria, didn't love him as much, he felt, as she loved her other grandchildren.
The Kaiser's cousin, King George, sat on the British throne and ruled Europe's most powerful empire by far. Yet the king and another cousin, Russia's Tsar, so feared the Kaiser as a menace and a bully that they formed an alliance against him. In the summer of 1914, Europe was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. On June the 28th, 1914, in the streets of the Bosnian capital, Sarajevo, a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, assassinated the favorite nephew and heir of the Austrian emperor. The last words of Archduke Franz Ferdinand were, "Es ist nicht," it is nothing. But nothing could have been further from the truth. 1 month later, Austria declared war on Serbia with the support of Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm. That meant Austria and Germany going to war with Serbia's ally Russia, Russia's ally France, and Great Britain. Which meant the Kaiser would be at war with his cousins, Tsar Nicholas and King George. By August 1914, nearly all of Europe was involved. On August the 12th, President Wilson returned to Washington from his wife's funeral with notes for a speech that he delivered to Congress a week later. He declared that America's response to this madness would be neutrality. As the rest of the world's powers took up arms, America would work for peace.
Wilson saw the United States as a city on the hill, a virtuous nation standing apart, whose role, as he soon came to believe, was to be primarily as a mediator.
President Wilson told the nation this was America's opportunity to gain great permanent glory. But King and Kaiser considered Wilson irrelevant. Their soldiers thought him a starry-eyed idealist. At that moment, most of Europe was convinced that the road to glory was the road to war. For the millions of young Europeans who joined up on both sides in 1914, war was seen as an exhilarating adventure. Donald Hodge thought it sounded like a bracing holiday from his job as a printer's apprentice in a suburb of London.
As soon as I enlisted, I was in a crowd of other 18, 19 and 20-year-olds, and we thought it was going to be a tremendous lark to go and knock the Kaiser off his throne, you see.
In Canada, 14-year-old Roy Henley liked the look of the uniform in the recruitment office window.
So I walked in. Recruiting sergeant, how old are you? I said, 16. You're too young. He says, go on, take a walk around the block. You might age. Come back, I got smart then. Well, how old are you? Going on 18. Fine, sign here. That's that.
And Ted Francis remembered how much he'd enjoyed being a Boy Scout. He joined up in Birmingham, England, in the very first weeks of the war.
Everyone thought the war would be over at Christmas, and they really badly wanted to get to France to get in the fighting. It's a long, long way to the but my heart is right there.
Until they got to the front, it was like being a Boy Scout.
And then someone said to us excitedly, Jack Smith. I said, what about him? He's dead. He's been shot. The first one of the battalion to be shot. I said, what? Yes, he's dead, been shot. He put his head too far over and a sniper got him. And that caused a bit of a sensation amongst the lads. They thought, well, this is not exactly what we come for kind of business. But later on, from that day onwards, when we went to the trenches, it was 3 killed, 4 killed, 5 killed, 20 killed, 100 killed. By then, we was veterans.
Imagine the kind of disillusion people suffered when they discovered that the war was going to be not just brutal and awful, but long. There was no way out of it except to kill more people on the other side. And so all of Europe and England had built itself into a box that they couldn't escape.
It seems incredible that man could be guilty of such hatred of his fellow man, such savage lust for slaughter.
Generals and soldiers alike were shocked by the deadly capabilities of 20th century technology. Machine guns, an American invention perfected in Europe, artillery shells, and poison gas which the Germans introduced made the Western Front an unimaginable hell.
There were just the splintered trunks of trees, and there was the quagmire of the shell holes, and no grass. It was just like a lunar landscape, really.
At night, the rats, they grew to enormous sizes, feeding on the corpses there. It was impossible to get the dead buried.
We put dead bodies in the bottom of the trench so that we could stand on them to keep dry. And on some occasion, dead bodies was put on the top of the trench to make it higher, so that we could walk a bit better instead of crouching.
Only 5 months into the war, nearly 1 million men were already dead. Millions more were trapped in trenches stretching 500 miles from the English Channel across Belgium and France. The trenches were no better than graves for the living.
When I come back to you, love, someday.
Americans never dreamed that the war on the other side of the ocean might affect them. President Wilson had declared the United States officially neutral, and most of its citizens assumed the country would stay that way. Henry Villard came from a family that was active in the peace movement. They thought Wilson was a hero for keeping America out.
It was a different world. It was a quiet, peaceful world. People were going about their own business, object being to make money. Everything was very pleasant indeed.
By early 1915, Americans going about their business had found that war was very good business. American bankers were lending money to Britain and France so that they could buy weapons and ammunition from Americans. The economy had never been so robust. In the spring of 1915, even the mood in the White House had brightened. The recently widowed president had fallen in love.
After my grandmother died, some months passed, and my grandfather's eye was caught by Edith.
Edith Galt, that is. The president had come home from playing golf with his doctor, Cary Grayson, when he encountered Edith Galt, who was visiting Wilson's cousin in the White House.
There was a moment where they were a little awkwardly meeting, but then were invited to sit down and have tea, and from that point on, the romance blossomed.
In the first week of May, the president shocked Mrs. Galt with a passionate proposal of marriage. At first, she turned him down, saying they'd only known each other for 2 months. Wilson persuaded her this was her fate. In New York City on May the 1st, 1915, 1,900 people boarded the luxury liner the Lusitania at Pier 54. The pride of the British Cunard Line was setting sail for England.
She was simply a wonderful, steady ship. She had 4 red funnels, and she was a beautiful sight to see. She really was.
Edith Stanley and her family were going home. The First World War was almost a year old, and any transatlantic crossing was made potentially dangerous by the presence of German submarines. But the passengers felt safe. No one would dare sink a passenger ship. Still, the German embassy had put a notice in the New York Times that very morning which said, "Travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk." The captain told a reporter that the warning was the best joke he'd heard in years. After 6 uneventful days at sea, on a beautiful sunny afternoon, May the 7th, the Lusitania was passing safely by the Irish coast.
It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You could see all this coastline, and then bang! Dad knew what it was. I mean, that he knew darn well it was a torpedo.
The German torpedo did such damage to the Lusitania that she sank in 18 minutes. Only 6 of her lifeboats were launched.
But we could not take the people in that were begging to be taken in. I mean, we would have capsized and everybody would have gone. 1,200 drowned, didn't they? I think it was 1,200 drowned. More drowned than were saved.
Including 128 Americans.
The Lusitania, that's only 3 years after the Titanic. One writer said, now it's the act of man, not the act of God, that has done this.
The British and the French hoped that this outrage would bring the Americans into the war on their side. But that night, President Wilson refused even to hear the details of the sinking, fearing that he would react too strongly and lose control. President Wilson agonized at his typewriter for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he finally typed out not a declaration of war, but a strongly worded note of protest to the Kaiser.
The Kaiser reacted with, as he always did, with a blend of defiance and concern. He would sort of wave his good fist in the air and saying, "No man tells me what to do. This little Wilson is only a college professor. Who cares about him?" And the next he would say, "There are a lot of those Americans over there, and they have a lot of industrial capacity. We'd better be careful."
When the Germans sank another British liner with the loss of 2 more American lives, the president protested again. This time he threatened to break diplomatic relations with Germany. On September the 1st, Wilson got what he wanted, a pledge from the Germans that they would call off their submarines. The British and the French were angry that Wilson refused to enter the war. On the Western Front, the British troops had come up with a joke. They called the shells that wouldn't explode, the duds, Wilsons. By the new year in 1916, over a year into the war, there was no movement whatsoever along the Western Front. The generals of both armies had resorted to a most primitive form of warfare, throwing men at each other in a desperate attempt to punch through enemy lines. All this did was result in unparalleled carnage. In late June, the British commander, General Douglas Haig, was ready to launch an attack the British were sure would break the deadlock. 200 British battalions were deployed on a front 25 miles wide along the River Somme in France.
For 6 months, people had been preparing for it. Special railway tracks had been laid to help bring the ammunition and materials and the artillery up.
There had never been an artillery barrage like this. For 5 continuous days and nights, the British shelled the German trenches.
They were hoping to burst through with that attack and allow the cavalry, which were behind them, to rush through all the way to Berlin and to end the war victoriously.
Ted Francis remembered it vividly.
There must be 1,000 guns if there was one. It was a terrible roar from morning till night. But the officers said, "Tomorrow, boys, you'll be over the top, and don't worry," he says. "There'll be no trenches there. Our shells have blown to pieces. There'll be no Germans there. They're blown to pieces. All you have to do is to walk over and take those trenches. In fact," he says, "you can carry your rifle like a bag."
At 7:30 a.m. on July the 1st, 1916, General Haig ordered the shelling stopped. In the sudden silence, 11 British divisions, more than 100,000 men, stepped into no man's land.
They didn't get 200 feet from the trench.
The German trenches were deeper and better fortified than the Allies knew.
The Germans, after the shelling, they simply come out of the dugouts, grabbed their machine guns, and then waited for the Tommies. They just simply swabbed them down. So you're cutting down grain. One German machine gunner said, "I stopped firing because I was sickened by what we were doing."
On that single summer day, 22,000 British soldiers were killed. 40,000 were wounded. It was one of the bloodiest days in the history of war.
It was a butcher shop magnified by 1,000,000 times.
But General Haig reported to London, "It all went like clockwork. Our troops are in wonderful spirits and full of confidence. The way to capture machine guns," he said, "is by grit and determination." The British commanders ordered more troops over the top, and they were gunned down. Ted Francis and his battalion waited for their signal to go.
Officers are down below us in the trenches with a whistle, and when they blow that whistle, we got to dash out of the trenches and make for this German trench. And it is in those few 4 or 5 minutes that we look at each other and say, "Oh, well, now I shall do this." Some were visibly shaking. Some were crying. Some were almost shell-shocked before they start.
And yet, the British sense of honor was such that they had very few deserters. Nobody ever quit, sensibly. They just couldn't arrive at that violation of British ethical norms.
And when before the German hail of lead and explosive, even these stout-hearted hesitated, Piper Laidlaw mounted the parapet and won his Victoria Cross, piping his comrades forward.
And so they rushed forward, and they were shot down repeatedly and repeatedly. At that moment, all of Europe's views about warfare had to be changed. The idea of heroism was dead from that moment, because it didn't help you to survive whether you were heroic or not.
The Battle of the Somme lasted 5 months. There were 1 million casualties, and the front line never moved more than 3 miles in either direction. To break the terrible deadlock, the Germans looked to the sea. On January the 31st, 1917, President Wilson got word that 100 German submarines had taken up positions in the Atlantic with orders to fire at will on all Allied and neutral ships, including unarmed American ships.
I think that shook people into a realization that we were in it, that we were, like, whether we liked it or not, that we were involved.
Wilson had just been re-elected on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But the pressure in the country to fight the Germans was building. On February 3rd, the president broke diplomatic relations with Germany, but he did not declare war. 3 American ships were torpedoed and sunk in a week. Still, the president hesitated. An intercepted telegram revealed a German plot encouraging Mexico to invade the United States. Still, Wilson did not declare war. Then he heard the news from London.
The British finally explained the truth of their situation. They were broke. They didn't have any money left. They didn't have any men left. But for the first time, Wilson had to face up to the possibility of a British-French defeat.
What a step to take, to be president of a country about to go to war in the world. He needed God's help for that. and he felt it.
At 8 p.m. on April the 2nd, 1917, the President stood before the House and the Senate and asked for a declaration of war. "We have no selfish ends to serve," he told the members. "We desire no conquest, no dominion. We are but one of the champions of mankind. But the world," he said, "must be made safe for democracy." That night, for only the second time, the Capitol was lit with electric light.
He received the biggest ovation of his life. The country was ready to go to war. Wilson himself, strangely, was not. There was an element to Wilson's character that was bound to see war as a tremendous human tragedy and folly. And when Wilson went back to the White House and put his head on the cabinet table and sobbed uncontrollably.
On April the 6th, 1917, the United States ended its isolation from Europe with a declaration of war on Germany. Woodrow Wilson's America believed it was going to war to end all war.
Wilson formulated a doctrine that, in a sense, has haunted us ever since. If we had to get involved in the wars and politics of Europe, it would have to be with the object of changing them. So, of changing the whole European-ruled world.
Cornel Davis clipped Wilson's speech from the newspaper in his Mississippi high school library and memorized it.
He said, "Right is more precious than peace, and we're going to fight for the things which we have carried nearest our heart. We're going to fight for a universal dominion of right. By such a concert of free people, it's going to bring peace and happiness to the whole world."
For this kind of war, even Henry Villard could convince his family of pacifists to let him go.
The idea of a last great war and being part of it was very, very strong. I said, if we're never going to see another war, this is the time to see it.
But this crusade would require more than a handful of idealists. In April 1917, the U.S. Army had only about 200,000 soldiers. 3 million men would be needed. The president would have to mobilize an entire nation.
He changed. He said, we've got to fight this war and we've got to win it.
Woodrow Wilson, once the world's most eloquent voice for peace, had become the nation's most persuasive advocate for war. As Americans mobilized for war, many Europeans had had enough. Exhausted by 3 years of senseless fighting, more than 30,000 French soldiers had mutinied. British hospitals were treating something they'd never seen before, shell shock, a mutiny of the mind and the body against the horror of war. In Russia, where millions of soldiers had deserted and starving peasants hungered for peace, revolution was brewing. And then into this chaos came a Russian exile. On April the 16th, Vladimir Lenin arrived at Finland Station in Petrograd.
He was met by a large number of people, and he stood on an armored personnel carrier and gave a speech about how Russia needed to leave the war.
He spoke with a lot of gestures.
Sasha Bryansky was there.
Thrust forward, calling us to advance, saying power had been taken over by the bourgeoisie that went on with the bloody war. A new order had to be established to ensure the power of the working class.
Early in the morning of November the 7th, 1917, the Russian Revolution began with a nearly bloodless coup. On November the 8th, Lenin announced the world's first communist nation, and that Russia would no longer fight the Germans.
We declare peace. Russia leaves the war. We tell the army to come home. We tell Germany and the Western powers, stop this war, end this war. Join us in declaring peace.
For the Germans, this was not just a stroke of luck.
Lenin had been sent by the Germans into Russia for the very purpose of overthrowing the pro-Allied regime and taking Russia out of the war.
Lenin's announcement was doubly devastating to the British and the French, who were still waiting for American troops to reinforce the Western Front.
They're scared. They're just plain scared of the effect this Bolshevik propaganda is having on their own supporters. That's Wilson's great opening.
President Wilson and Vladimir Lenin had one thing in common. Each man wanted to change the world. In January 1918, President Wilson stepped onto the world stage with his alternative to the old balance of power. To a Europe devastated by war, the president proposed his 14-point program for world peace. He championed the rights of all people to governments of their own choosing, and a peaceful world preserved by a league of nations so that nothing like this would ever happen again. Peace, said Wilson, is what Americans were fighting for. By May of 1918, hundreds of thousands of American troops were pouring into France every month, ready to fight and infused with the spirit of their crusade.
Keep your head down, Fritzy boy. Keep your head down, Fritzy boy.
The Americans were seen as victory's men, fresh and young and confident. Albert Powys, a Marine of the Fighting Fifth, was ready for action.
We were used for morale boosters. We'd go to the camps where they had was resting up the English and the French and that there, and we'd march past them there, you know, with our heads up and one thing and another. We was cocky as the devil. And that was to bring up their morale. Our morale was really high. We was coming to the end of our men, and when the Americans decided to have a go, I could have said hooray.
Cocky as they were, the first American units to arrive on the battlefield were just as horrified by the reality of war as the Europeans had been 4 years earlier. Henry Villard had left Harvard to drive an ambulance in Italy. On his first day, he learned how far from home he was.
The first person that I put into the ambulance was a man who had a grenade exploding in his hands, and it had blown off both his legs. So he was moaning and groaning the entire time from the front lines to the hospital, calling out for me to drive slowly. And by the time I reached the hospital, he was dead. Well, this was a kind of a cold water treatment all of a sudden to realize what war was like. It was no longer freshman studies. It was the real world.
50,000 Americans died in battle on the Western Front in the summer and fall of 1918. But there were so many Americans pouring off ships month after month, and the news that there were 3 million more on their way convinced the German generals there was no hope.
The roof was falling in. More and more Americans were coming. Germany was starving, and finally there was practically a mutiny. The Kaiser gave up.
The German generals drove the Kaiser into exile in Holland. They installed a new government and appealed to President Wilson for peace on his terms. Finally, at 11 o'clock on November the 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the shooting stopped.
That sudden hush, after 4 years of continual gunfire, had become part of our life. There seemed to be something missing. We didn't believe it, you know.
Nearly 10 million people had died in 4 years of war. The World War had destroyed a world, and no one knew what would come in its place. In December 1918, 1 month after the armistice ending the Great War was signed, the USS George Washington arrived off the coast of France. On it, the President and his wife Edith, bound for the peace conference in Paris. Never before in the history of the world had millions of people come out for one man, such as the people of Europe did for President Wilson. They had come out to cheer for the American president, for the principles he stood for, and the peace that he promised.
He was greeted as a savior. His great hopes, his enormous confidence for a peaceful future for the world, were actually the hopes of Europeans, men and women and children who had just been through the ghastly experience of World War I.
Armed with American optimism and his 14 points, President Wilson intended to dismantle the old balance of power and to create a world without conquest or colonies, where all peoples would have a right to self-determination and a league of democratic nations to keep the peace.
He had enormous currency when the conference began for what he stood for. Things changed when he had to sit down with the other heads of government and heads of state with whom he had to work out the details of the League and of the peace.
We were going to change their politics. We were going to change their politics in such a way that there wouldn't be wars anymore. We would change their politics in a way that would make them like us. And that's what he was there in Paris to do. And how on earth was he going to do it? He never, ever seems to have thought out this question of what are the means and methods and so on that would enable him to achieve those objectives. And all he knew how to do was make beautiful speeches. And that's not enough.
The European powers had a long laundry list of grievances. They had paid in blood, in the blood of millions of men, for whatever they could get, and they were determined to get something. And Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain, and Clemenceau of France, and Orlando of Italy, were not going to turn the other cheek after they'd gone through this bloody 4-year war. They wanted revenge.
Wilson was furious. He did not think the Germans should be humiliated. He asked the French Prime Minister, Clemenceau, if he'd ever been to Germany. No, Clemenceau answered, but the Germans have been to France twice in my lifetime. Wilson, the moralizing college professor, was no match for the battle-scarred European leaders. In the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, Wilson realized their true intentions had nothing to do with peace. By the rules of their game, to the victors would go the spoils. Great Britain and France made short work of Wilson's 14 points and carved up the fallen German, Austrian, and Ottoman empires in ways that would haunt the rest of the century. The victors divided the Middle East among them and partitioned Eastern Europe to create new nations with old grudges. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June the 28th, 1919, 5 years to the day after Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated in Sarajevo. Their terms for Germany were so punishing that another great war seemed inevitable.
And because Versailles didn't settle the issues, after an intermission of 20 years, that war began again in 1939. It's a mere continuation of the, I shouldn't say mere, a continuation of the First World War. And that war, in turn, could not be brought to an end in 1945 because the Allies quarreled. And that quarrel over peace terms is what we call the Cold War. The result is that the war that broke out in August 1914 did not come to an end until August 31st, 1994, when the last Russian troops left German soil.
Woodrow Wilson had salvaged only 1 point from the wreckage of his 14, the League of Nations. To him, it was the last great hope for world peace. But America, sick of war, disgusted with Europe, turned its back on Wilson and on the world. The Treaty of Versailles was never ratified by the Senate. The United States never joined the League of Nations. President Wilson suffered a devastating stroke as he tried to convince the country otherwise. His vision of the world would survive him, an increasingly democratic world led by the United States. "I would rather fail in a cause that someday will triumph," he said, "than to win in a cause that I know someday will fail." I'm Peter Jennings. For the Century. Good night.
You can read more about this remarkable time in the century, written by Peter Jennings and Todd Brewster, published by Doubleday and sold in bookstores everywhere. Also look for the Century audiobook edition, available on compact disc and audio cassette.